Welcome back to the Best Wines Online Tasting Room. I'm Kyle Meyer, and I'm here to talk to you today about the Southern Rhone. Now, the Southern Rhone is a big place. Let's get that out of the way quickly. Basically, how big is it? Well, from the area, okay, from the basic area, just to get a sense of the size, we're talking about 420 million bottles a year produced on average from this area, from the Southern Rhone. And that's a ballpark. It can fluctuate every year, but think about that, 420 million bottles. So it's a big place. And, you know, like most big places, it tends to be broken down into separate appellations, of which we're going to cover with you today. But, you know, the point here is we're not going to get all technical with you, okay? We're not going to get into like the really hardcore details of the appellation, because that'd be like mind-numbing, and I fall asleep when I hear it.
Because you're not dead.
Don't let them take you into surgery.
Until you're brain dead.
So what we're going to do is we're going to tackle some of the basics of Southern Rhone wine. Some of the things that you should look out for as a consumer, some of the things that we look out for as buyers. So let's get things kicked off with the Cotes du Rhone itself. Now, the Southern Rhone Valley, kind of the catch-all appellation in the Southern Rhone, is what we call the Cotes du Rhone. And this area is big. I mean, basically almost anything from the Southern Rhone comes into play and technically could be labeled as a Cotes du Rhone. Now, when we're talking about Cotes du Rhone, there's a couple main grape varieties we need to look for in the Cotes du Rhone wines. And you know, this is going to apply pretty much to the Southern Rhone as we go through the list of areas. The main grape variety, kind of like the linchpin, the benchmark, the cornerstone grape variety in the Southern Rhone is Grenache, the Grenache grape, which some of you may be familiar with you know, like maybe your mom was drinking like, you know, Gallo, white Grenache, you know, this sort of deal. It was one of those kind of like, you know, Fresno, Central California type grape varieties growing there for years to produce bulk wine, because it can be a heavy yielder and it yields wines of fruit and high alcohol, and there's an ease to the wines. Now, in the Rhone Valley, they treat Grenache a little differently. The soils are very different, the vines are very old, so in essence you have this, you have a grape variety there that still has that ease of drinkability, that warmth, that roundness, but also a greater intensity from these older vineyards and this different soil layout. Now, with Cotes du Rhone, within the Cotes du Rhone appellation itself, what you can have is something they call Cotes du Rhone Village. Okay, and what happens with Cotes du Rhone Village is basically it's kind of like Cotes du Rhone with the volume turned up. Okay, the minimum required alcohol level is like 0.5% to 1% higher, if I'm not mistaken, and the wines just need to be a little more robust, a little more intense, and they can only come from certain delineated areas, easy for me to say, within the Rhone Valley. All right, so not all Cotes du Rhone is Cotes du Rhone Village. Only a small part of the Cotes du Rhone appellation can be labeled as Village. Now, traditionally within this Village appellation in the Southern Rhone, we had kind of like what the French refer to as lieux-dits, like these named villages, okay, these areas that were kind of groovier than other parts of the Cotes du Rhone, because as we said before, the Cotes du Rhone is a really big place. And the Cotes du Rhone being so big, okay, there's certain areas that are better than others. Now, traditionally, we found these villages, these special groovier villages, labeled on individual bottles of Cotes du Rhone Village wine. All right. Some of these villages you might have seen before are Séguret, Queyron, Plan de Dieu, Sablé, and all of these areas are just kind of, they're groovier, they're just better. They make more complex, more intense, fuller Cotes du Rhone wines. So they're allowed to say Cotes du Rhone Village and then have their little village attached to it if they so choose. Some do, some don't, it's a preference. But if you see that village, know that you're getting a certain level of quality above and beyond the normal Cotes du Rhone wine. Very important. Now, the next step. Within the Cotes du Rhone for years, a couple of these villages were known as being even a cut above the other Cotes du Rhone villages. Okay, they were super groovy. So what they decided to do is over a period of time, the Rhone is pretty open about granting what they call appellation status to these villages. If these villages can prove that they make a super high quality wine for a long enough period of time, you know, the French wine bureaucracy says, okay, you're this. Now, what's happened in the last few years is a couple of these all-star villages within the Cotes du Rhone have been granted kind of like their own special appellation. So now, where we used to see a wine called Cotes du Rhone Village Rosteau, Now a lot of these wines just say Rosteau on them. Rosteau is one of these villages that's been granted a special appellation. Well, why? Because the wines are unique. They're different. They're not your typical Cotes du Rhone. In the case of Rosteau, these wines have generate a lot of power, and they have this wonderful combination of Grenache and Syrah. Syrah does quite well in Rosteau. So you get these very powerful, intense wines from Rosteau of a high quality level. Now another village that recently was granted its own appellation within the Cotes du Rhone, or within the Southern Rhone, is Vin Sobre. Vin Sobre, easy, we'll put it up, it's easy for you to say, right? So the deal with Vin Sobre, what makes it so special and unique is its elevation. It's up in the hills of the Cotes du Rhone. And when you have elevation, you can have fineness, you can have elegance, you can have power, and it's a little racier, it's cooler up there. Accordingly, the Syrah grape does very well in Vin Sobre because it likes it a little cooler. It likes the elevation. So a lot of the wines from that area we see as a little more Syrah dominated. Still heavy on the Grenache, but a little more Syrah coming into the blends. And there's some cuvées that are actually more heavily Syrah. Those wines are, again, powerful, bright, racy, and the Vin Sobre wines tend to be even a little more expensive than the Rosteau wines. I think the area is maybe a bit smaller, there's less of it produced, and a lot of the producers in that area are tiny. But if you see Vin Sobre or Rosteau in a bottle, notice you're getting something big and powerful and pretty intense for the money. Now, that pretty much sums up the Cotes du Rhone itself, as well as some of those satellite appellations that were previously Cotes du Rhone, but are now kind of their own gig. Are we clear on that? Good. Now, let's move on to the big dogs. Southern Rhone is known for probably half a dozen unique and different appellations within the Southern Rhone. And we're going to start right at the top. We're going to start with Chateauneuf-du-Pape. Okay, where'd the name come from? Well, some people think it's the ninth, people used to think it was the ninth house of the Pope, and it's funny because there's a producer in Australia who makes a wine called Nine Popes, kind of on a riff of that name, of Chateauneuf-du-Pape. But in fact, it was kind of like the new house of the Pope, right? Because what happened is the Pope got tired of the Vatican, and so he was like where can I go, where can I go, where can I go? Avignon's nice. So the Pope, he settled in Avignon, and from there, well, the Pope needs wine to drink, right? So basically, that's where Chateauneuf kind of got its start. It was this town, this small hilltop town, and an appellation grew around it based on the popularity of the area when the Pope had moved everything to Avignon. Now, Chateauneuf is considered probably the greatest appellation, the highest quality appellation within the Southern Rhone. Chateauneuf-du-Pape is known for these wines that are powerful but warm, with these kind of kirschy, cran raspberry qualities to them. Grenache is the main grape, but between red Chateauneuf and white Chateauneuf, there can be up to 18 or 19, I think they made it 19 now, permitted grape varieties. It's amazing the number of grape varieties that come into play with this particular wine. They are Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre, Carignan, Cinsault, Cunoise, Muscardin, Picpoul Noir, Tourette Noir, and Vacquerez for the reds. And then for the whites, we have Bourbon, we have Claret Blanc, we have Claret Rose, we have Grenache Blanc, we have Grenache Gris, Picardin, Picpoul Blanc, Picpoul Gris, and Roussanne. Got it? There will be a test. Righteous. Anyway, it's a lot of grape varieties. But what we see in Chateauneuf-du-Pape is basically the appellation hangs its hat on three main grape varieties. For the reds, we're talking Grenache and Syrah and Mourvèdre. Those are the main ones. And then what happens is all those other grape varieties I mentioned, they're kind of like spices, seasoning, the salt, the pepper, the oregano, etc. And the deal is a lot of these Chateauneuf-du-Pape vineyards are very old. They were planted, many of the vineyards that survive today were planted post-phylloxera, so from the late 1800s into the early 1900s. There's a lot of this vineyard left because in Chateauneuf, the weather is very fine. It's very windy. There's no disease pressure there. There's nothing that kind of would bear down the grapevines and make them go, to get them sick, okay? Very healthy vines down there that live a very long time. And that's one of the beauties of Chateauneuf-du-Pape is are these older vines that they have to work with, these older bush vines trained what they call en gobelet, in kind of a goblet shape. Let's see, there's a north and a south side of Chateauneuf. The north side's a bit cooler, the wines are a bit more elegant. The south side of Chateauneuf a bit warmer, the wines are a bit more intense. There's kind of three main soil types in Chateauneuf that most producers work with. There is what they call the galets roule, which is the river stones, these big, stony, almost impossible to get through type soils. There's sand, that famous places like Reyes and Pignon and such, they focus on the sandy soils, which give a finer wine. And then there's kind of like an in-between type soil, it's like a pebbly, kind of more loamier type soil, which gives us very traditional Chateauneuf-du-Pape wines. Again, the wines of Chateauneuf-du-Pape are full in flavor, they're rich, winter warmer type wines, and they age wonderfully in the midterm. We're talking about maybe 7 to 10 years. These Chateauneuf wines are looking really fine.